Hello and welcome to another episode of the Fingal's Cave podcast. In this episode, we celebrate the 40-year anniversary of David Gilmour's live performances between 1984 and 2024. For this endeavor, we have a special guest in our little studio. He's a very successful musician himself and the creator and owner of the well-known website gilmourish.com. Welcome, Bjorn Riis. It's great to have you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'm also pleased to welcome back Mike McCartney, and we are delighted to welcome Joe Krist for the first time. Not only are Mike and Joe massive David Gilmour fans, they also have been specialists for years. Hi guys, nice to have you.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
So, before we start talking about Pink Floyd and David Gilmour, we would like to learn a little bit more about you, Bjorn. As I mentioned in the introduction, you have been a musician for many years. In 2000, you formed a band called Airbag with your high school classmates and have released 5 well-acclaimed albums since then.
Yeah, we all of us are located in Oslo, Norway. A couple of us went to high school together, and at some point we decided to start a band. And I remember coming to school the first day. I was changing schools, and I had a Pink Floyd T-shirt on me, and a couple of guys came up to me and said, "Nice shirt." And they're still best friends, and one is the vocalist in my band. So and we saw Pink Floyd here in Oslo in '94 on the Division Bell tour, and based on that experience we started a band, which was really in the first years it was really about learning to play an instrument, and eventually that turned into a Pink Floyd tribute act that we did for probably a decade or so, touring Norway, focusing on the 70s and recreating shows like Wembley 74, Oakland 77 and stuff like that. And at some point, we decided to start writing our own material. So we've been doing that since the early 2000s.
Okay, great. And you also released some albums as a solo artist. And I just listened again and again the last days your latest album called Fimbul Winter. And it's a wonderful album. And it somehow, and you might find that a little bit strange, but it somehow reminds me of, besides Pink Floyd, of course, of Gravenhurst or even Tool. I know Tool is a metal band, but could you relate to that comparison somehow?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I grew up in the late 70s and 80s, and I listened to bands like Kiss, Pink Floyd, Whitesnake, Led Zeppelin, and all that stuff. So that's really my musical background. And later in the late 80s or early 90s, I discovered Pink Floyd through some friends and mainly my older sister. So Pink Floyd and David Gilmour has obviously been a huge inspiration and a huge part of my music, but I think my core is the 70s rock stuff. So absolutely, I can relate to that.
So you also created the website gilmourish.com almost 25 years ago, and still publish interesting news on it frequently. What was your main vision when you started that website?
This was around the time that we did the Pink Floyd tribute act, and my job was to do David Gilmour, and this was it was the mid 90s, and in the very early days of the internet. So you really didn't have any information available other than whatever was in a current guitar magazine, or if you were lucky, you could find some older magazines. So I started to collect information mainly for myself, figuring out what kind of guitars, amps, and pedals that I was going to use in the tribute band. And then I decided to do a website because there wasn't any. And it very fast became very popular, and I gathered more and more information from viewers and people contributing. So it's really I've been the only host for 25 years. I designed everything and collected everything, but it's really a collection of contributions and lots of people that has helped me build that site.
Besides all that, you also run a very successful YouTube channel where you post videos about all things Pink Floyd, David Gilmour. How do you find the time to manage all that besides composing, being a musician, going on tour with your band, going on tour with solo acts? Wow.
Yeah, well, I have to admit that Gilmour-ish and the David Gilmour YouTube channel isn't my first priority anymore. As the band and my solo career has grown bigger, and having to balance that with being a father, husband, and going to work and doing all the boring grown-up stuff, I don't have the time that I used to, but it's still great fun, and I have so many friends that's been with me for many years from all around the world. So it's still something that I try to find the time to do. But yeah,
Once again, it's a real honor and pleasure to have you on this podcast. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thanks.
So before we start talking about David Gilmour live, I think it's important to learn a little bit about the equipment he used over the years with Pink Floyd between 1968 and 1994. And I know this is one of your main topics on your website. So could you just give us an overview about how David's gear developed over these decades?
Yeah, I think what's fascinated me about David Gilmour is obviously his way of using pedals and effects to create his tones, which has been important for him, but also for the development of Pink Floyd and their sound. But it's also the case of him being present in the time of all this gear happening and appearing. Back in 1968, when he joined, you had pretty much one or two effects pedals, maybe a echo unit, and he pretty much started with the same gear as Syd Barrett. He borrowed some of his guitars and his Selmer amps and stuff like that. And like Jimi Hendrix and other contemporaries, he mostly used 1, 2, or 3 pedals because that was pretty much all you could find. And he's developing his sound throughout the 1970s, in particular in the earliest 1980s, along with all these pedals being introduced. So you can sort of see the evolution of guitar effects and listen to him as a guitarist, as a solo artist, as a member of Pink Floyd, how he developed his sound and how Pink Floyd developed their sound, and see that with the history of the effect pedal. So he starts out with doing pretty much the same thing as Syd Barrett with the Telecasters, some British Selmer amps, a fuzz pedal, a wah pedal. And then he, around 1972, he starts to incorporate different effects. And even earlier than that, he has the high-watt amps, more guitars. And I think the biggest change in his early setup is the Dark Side of the Moon tour in 1973, when he introduces the first pedal board, apparently designed by one of the Pink Floyd roadies. And that one includes a lot of different effects. And he has the large amp rack and the wall of a VEM speaker behind him. And he's using Leslie cabinets. And that develops into the Animals era, which sort of is the same setup he's using on Animals' 1978 solo album, The Wall, and also Final Cut with the larger Pete Cornish boards. Lots of new effects. And I think one of the key components in that setup is the Big Muff. And I don't think you could have an album like Animals and as aggressive as it sounds without the Big Muff. You can talk about the production and Roger Waters' vision for everything, but the Big Muff, at least for me, that's a key component in how aggressive that album sounds. By the 80s, the early 80s, a lot of stuff happens with digital technology. And his first solo album in 1984, and a lot of the solo and guest appearances throughout the 1980s, you see him developing from analog stuff to more digital stuff. He's modifying his guitars with synthesizers, and he's using a lot of digital pedal boards and the more compact Boss units and everything, and sort of becomes that modern guitar player. But I think the thread in everything here is that him and Pink Floyd are experimenting with new technology, new sounds, which they they looking back at it now, they're discussing this on the 71 Pompeii film and how much they're into new technology and stuff. But it's really not until the late 70s and early 80s when you can see that Pink Floyd is really driven by technology. And that continues with the Momentary Lapse of Reason album and Delicate Sound Thunder. And that's kind of where the whole effects and pedal evolution stops in a way. When you come to the 90s, there's more of a resurgence of going back to the original units, fuzz pedals and vintage guitars and tube amps and stuff like that. And you can see that also with Division Bell and how they recorded that album. David is going back to his older amps, his older pedal boards. And obviously with On an Island and Forward, he's going even further back to his old late 70s stuff.
So let's start with 1978 now. The first David Gilmour solo album, which was called David Gilmour. Mike, please tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, well, it's the end of a touring cycle for Pink Floyd. They ended their massive In the Flesh tour in early July of 77. The second half of the tour through North America was a size and scale of tour for the band that they had never really seen before. Their last show in particular was enormous, playing to an upward of 80,000 people at the Olympic Stadium in Montreal, Canada. David Gilmour's response to this massive tour was to reconvene with some friends, Rick Wills, Willie Wilson, and quote unquote, have some fun, doing something much, much smaller for his first solo album. This trio had also toured Spain and France in the summer of 1966 as Bullet, with the addition of David Altham, and they were called The Flowers in late 66 as a trio, where they toured France and Spain again. The album was recorded in late 77 and early 78 at Britannia Row Studios and Super Bear Studios located near Nice, France. The album itself was released May 26, 78. It's a very guitar-heavy album, which is, I would say, widely loved by Gilmour fans who discover it. Gilmour wrote the album on his own for the most part, with some co-writing done with 10cc's Eric Stewart. I think he co-wrote Cry from the Street, as well as Roy Harper, who co-wrote Short and Sweet with Gilmour. And then there's, of course, the cover of the Unicorn track, There's No Way Out of Here, which was the quote-unquote single from this album. During these sessions, Gilmour also started roughing out musical ideas that would eventually become Run Like Hell and Comfortably Numb. So yeah, really great album. I mean, I will personally say I'm a huge fan of that album. I got super hooked onto it when I was early on in Pink Floyd. Just lots to love there.
Yeah, I also have to admit that I really like it. One thing that is really, if I think about it, I have to at least smile a little. I mean, if you see at least the name of the tracks, Raise My Rent, No Way, Cry from the Street, So Far Away. If you compare that to Dark Side of the Moon, for example, I think Roger must have been puking seeing all that. I mean, it's a total opposite of Pink Floyd in every single way, and which is good. But it was at that time where Roger Waters really was more Roger Waters than ever before and ever after it, preparing the wall and everything. And then having a solo album, which is just about music and guitar and just having, a nice bluesy album. He must have gone mad about it. Do we know anything about that?
I do not. I've never seen much response to the album. I do think, though, you're making a good point. I think he did it to have some fun. And sometimes doing big structured things is really, really cool, but it's probably not always the most fun and doesn't give you a lot of room to breathe and just sort of let things happen organically. And I think that's what that first album really, really is. It's just him and his friends having some fun in the studio and making some music.
Yeah. So he never went on tour with that album. I think there are several reasons, but do we know more?
We don't know why. In all the interviews from this time, he states fairly definitively that there's no plans for touring. And sometimes he adds in that Pink Floyd are reconvening later in the year to get started on their next project. So presumably due to the impending return of Pink Floyd, I think that's why he didn't tour the album. However, he did make a promotional film for the album, performing 5 songs live at the Roxy in Covent Gardens, London. For those that have haven't seen it, it's a wonderful glimpse into what a 1978 David Gilmour tour could have been. I highly recommend any fans of Gilmour check out that promotional film on YouTube. It's wonderful. In some ways, I actually prefer the live recordings of some of the songs more than the studio recordings. I'm thinking specifically No Way is one that I go back to the live version much, much more frequently than I do the studio version.
So after working on The Wall, performing several live shows between 1980 and 81, and also, I would say, being involved in the movie in 82 because they had to rearrange some songs, and recording the final cut, even though I think he was not too much involved in that, besides putting in some guitar solos and everything. But then David released his second solo album, About Face, in 1984. Joe, please tell us a little bit about it.
Well, after his experience of recording the final cut, and it's widely known that there was a lot of tension between him and Roger during that particular era. David's gone on record saying that he wanted to make a solo album, get the best damn musicians he could get, and make an album. So he got Jeff Beccaro, he got Pino Palladino and Ian Cooley, which basically formed the nucleus of his recording band. And basically the early demos for that album were recorded at David's Hook End Manor studio. Tracking for the album was done at Pâté Marconi in France. The album features some orchestral arrangements from Michael Kamen. And the album was mixed at Mayfair Studios. The album was mastered at the Mastering Lab in LA by Doug Sachs. The songs were written and recorded over roughly a 6-month period of time. Out of the Blue was kind of a last-minute sort of addition to that album. The album was pretty much already done. At the very last minute, David rang Bob Ezrin, who was the producer of that particular, or co-producer of that album, and said, "Hey, I have one last track." Bob basically said, "Dude, it's done. No, you're not doing it." And then David sent it over anyway. Bob Ezrin listened to it and was like, "All right, yeah, we got to put that on there." So they did. And, you know, the album features 2 songs co-written with Pete Townsend, which was Love on the Air and All Lovers Are Deranged. All the other songs David wrote basically entirely by himself, which if you look at all of his other solo albums, that's pretty unique.
So when we spoke before, Bjorn, you mentioned that the record company somehow tried to create a guitar hero with David Gilmour and somehow changed the whole thing from the more or less nameless or incognito Pink Floyd members just being faceless to now here's David Gilmour and he's the superstar and the super guitarist. Do you think that worked out, the way they tried to change his, appearance?
No, and I think that's pretty evident looking at the pictures from that era. He's very uncomfortable. Going back to the guitar magazines from 84, 85, there's some talk, or David mentions, and some of the journalists also mentions that there was an attempt from, I guess it was EMI at the time, to sort of brand him, not necessarily make him into a guitar hero, but sort of brand him as a solo artist and a legendary guitarist he was the guitarist of Pink Floyd, and I think they pretty much knew at the time that Pink Floyd was over. And EMI was probably a bit stressed about that and wanted to sort of make him into the next Pink Floyd or whatever. And looking at the photos and how he was sort of branded in a way, it's pretty evident that they wanted to make him into a solo artist and perhaps even a guitar hero. And this was absolutely the time of the guitar hero with Ed Van Halen and all the new guitarists of the time. And obviously David was he was an old school guitarist. He wasn't the new generation of shredders. So yeah, it's interesting to to read about it and to look at the images in particular and see how uncomfortable he appears to be.
Yeah, I mean, even if you compare the early 70s artists like Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, and Genesis, for example, all these guys were somehow on stage as an appearance. They had, costumes or whatever. The faces were different. Everything was done just to have a show, and the appearance was everything. And Pink Floyd, they had their T-shirts on, and it was about everything but them. So it's a very bold move to try to, move that completely, turn around that 180 degrees and say, David, now you are the superstar. And yes, as you say, you can really see that he feels very uncomfortable about it. What do you think, Bjorn, about the technical development of that album in '84? I think it really sounds much different to anything before.
Yeah, and comparing it to the 78 album, which is definitely my favorite album, the 78 album is very 70s, very analog and warm sounding. The About Face is perhaps a bit more dated, and I think similar to how Roger Waters describes Radio Chaos, I think they went too far into the digital technology at the time and sort of being victims of all the fancy stuff that you could do. And although it's not as digital or technologically sounding as Radio Chaos, I think, at least for me, the thing that sort of makes it less so an album and an album that I really go back to is that it sounds very dated. But again, looking at the gear David used, he you can say that he's sort of a victim of the era. They're trying to brand him as a guitar hero. He's using a lot of new guitars and new pedals and digital effects and all that stuff. But it's also a continuation of him exploring new sounds and really being into what's new at the time, as they've been since the late 60s. And I also think you have to give his technician Phil Taylor a lot of credit for that as well, going back to June 74 when he joined and introducing David, and still does, to a lot of new stuff.
Speaking about the Pete Townsend songs, Love on the Air and All Lovers Are Deranged, it's worth seeking out Pete Townsend's version of All Lovers Are Deranged, which is available on his demo compilation called Scoop 3. Additionally, at this time, Gilmour co-wrote a song which appeared on the Roy Harper, Jimmy Page duo album, Whatever Happened to Jugula. This song's called Hope, but it also ends up returning with different lyrics on the Pete Townsend 1985 solo album, White City, a Novel, under the title White City Fighting, with Gilmour actually playing lead on the song, which he does not on the Roy Harper version.
Actually, going back to something that you said a little while ago, Mike, we don't know what Roger Waters thought of David Gilmour's first solo album or what any of the members thought of David Gilmour's album. One particular fan of that album was Pete Townsend. When Pink Floyd was recording the final cut, partially at Eel Pie Studios, during that recording, David Gilmour met with Pete Townsend, who happened to be at the studio one particular day. Pete Townsend said that he was a big fan of David Gilmour's first solo album and said, if you ever need any help in the future, give him a ring. And so he did. And then they ended up co-writing 2 songs for that album.
Great, interesting. So before we move on to the live tour in '84, I got a question from one David Gilmour fan I would like to ask you, Bjorn. And the question is, how did David achieve the tremolo effect on the intro of Until We Sleep? Do we know anything about that?
I've never been able to find out just what effect he was using. whether it was a pedal or some outboard studio gear. There is an interview from '86, I think, from Guitarist magazine. I might be wrong, but where he's talking about how he achieved the tremolo, because it's difficult to get tremolo to be in sync with the rest of the band, because tremolo has a way of sort of decaying, and the algorithm changes a bit. But there is a tremolo effect. I'm guessing that he's using some studio outboard gear, a rack unit or something. And it seems to be blended with a synth or keyboard of some sorts, which is what they did on the tour. If you listen to the live version of it, there's no guitars, there's just a keyboard.
So, this time, David went on tour. Let's talk about this tour specifically, because besides the saxophone's massive involvement, I'm going to talk about that later. It really offers a lot. So, Joe.
Well, the album was released March 5th, 1984, which is one day before his 38th birthday. The first actual date on that tour was March 31st, 1984, in Dublin, Ireland, which, I mean, really was the first proper live headlining show of any member of Pink Floyd. So as you can imagine, he was probably a little bit nervous. Listening to the recordings, it sounds like a pretty good show. Not his best, not his worst performance, but still pretty good. It was a pretty small venue. It was the National Stadium, which sounds pretty big, but actually is only about a 2,000-seat venue. Setlist was a bit interesting. He opened with Until We Sleep, and then the very next track was Run Like Hell, which is interesting because, you know, pretty much every show, every tour post, you know, midway through the About Face tour, Run Like Hell was either midway or towards the end or the encore for whatever tour, whatever show he was doing. There was a European leg of the 1984 tour that progressed through the Netherlands, France, Germany, and then the European leg of that tour kind of culminated with 3 shows at the Hammersmith Odeon, April 28th, 29th, and 30th of 1984. For the 29th and 30th of those dates, Nick Mason and Roy Harper decided to make an appearance. Interestingly, if any of you have ever read Ginger Gilmour's book, which I'm just going to say it out loud, don't waste your time. It's pretty bad. I mean, it's full of factual errors. It's full of spelling errors. You would think that as the ex-wife of David Gilmour, you could afford to get yourself an editor before you release a book, but apparently she decided not to. I mean, she can't even spell Syd Barrett's name right in the book. And then in the section for About Face, she claims that Richard Wright joined Nick Mason and David Gilmour for a performance of Comfortably Numb, which we know never happened. I did read somewhere that Richard Wright was in the audience for one of the Hammersmith Odeon shows, but I could not find the source for that, so I don't know if that's true or not. But Nick Mason, Roy Harper were definitely there. And yeah, we have an official video from those shows. The official video is a composite of the 29th and 30th. If I had to guess, I would say both of those shows were probably shot and recorded in their entirety. So it would be great if a remastered, re-edited version of that film came out, but I'm not going to hold my breath. It's probably never going to happen. Interestingly enough, there was a band that opened, or was supposed to open for those shows, a post-punk band called the Television Personalities. And they opened the first show of the Hammersmith Odeon run that he was doing. And they wrote a song called I Know Where Syd Barrett Lives. And during the first night that they opened for David Gilmour, they decided to reveal Syd Barrett's real address to the audience. Yeah. So obviously David didn't take too kindly to that, so he kicked them off and replaced them with Billy Bragg, who I'm not too familiar with. So after the European UK leg of the tour finished, The tour was slated to resume in Canada on May 8th in Quebec. The show was canceled due to low ticket sales. The real tour opener was the next night, May 9th, at the Coliseum in Quebec. And then there was a date, I believe, at the Montreal Forum, which is a huge venue. I can't imagine David in 1984 trying to fill that venue on his own in 1984, and that date was canceled due to low ticket sales as well. So it was a pretty rough start to the North American leg of that tour. By that time, Run Like Hell had moved to midway through the show. The Canadian leg of the tour lasted about 1 week. The US leg of the tour started in May 16th in Buffalo. It was around this time that Money finally entered the set list, obviously because it was a huge single in America when it was released. There's No Way Out of Here was removed from the set list. Listening to those recordings, there's some absolutely fantastic performances on that tour. But the one thing you notice, the difference between the European leg of the tour and the North American leg of the tour, is that the audiences are loud. They are there to party. They are there to boogie. They're there to have a good time. And I can imagine that probably irritated David quite a bit, I would imagine. And the tour concluded in July 16th in New York City. The entire tour had 73 dates altogether, which is pretty significant. The touring personnel for that tour was Greg Deckert, Mickey Fiat, Jody Lynn Scott, Mick Ralphs, Raph Ravenscroft, and Chris Slade. Unfortunately, Mick Ralphs just passed away not too long ago. So it's too bad. He was a hell of a guitar player. I feel the interaction between Mick Ralphs and David Gilmour on stage was incredible. I think he's one of the best, second guitar players David Gilmour has ever had on stage with him. So yeah, rest in peace, Mick Ralphs. He was great.
One thing I wanted to add about this tour that I always find fascinating is it's a very long tour. Like Joe mentioned, 78 shows is a lot of shows for a guy who's touring for the first time. It's incredibly well documented by recordings. I would say it feels like 70 of the shows are available on recording. I haven't counted, but it's a lot. And they used to be quite difficult to find in my early days of collecting because there wasn't a lot of Gilmour specialists around. It's a lot easier now. And when you piece all those recordings together, you get a pretty good snapshot of what that tour was like. I'm a big fan of these shows. There's some key songs that I always jump to, and sort of like Nils, I would imagine, there's some key songs that I stay away from. I'm generally not jumping to Blue Light every time I turn on a Gilmour 84 show, but there are some songs that I jump to consistently. I want to call out Cruise is absolutely fantastic in my opinion. Mihalis is absolutely fantastic on this tour. Let's Get Metaphysical, another great one near the end. Fantastic. I think you can't go wrong with a 1984 version of any of those songs. Yeah, I'm just going to leave that out there and see what everyone says.
Springing off of what you said, Mike, the tour is very well documented, but most importantly, a lot of the recordings that were done of this tour are of very good quality. Some particularly good ones, March 31st is very interesting. There's a couple of pretty decent audience recordings from that particular show. April 5th in the Netherlands is the first live performance of I Can't Breathe Anymore. It's absolutely fantastic. June 8th in Chicago is a great performance and a really, really good audience recording. It was done by an unknown taper, but apparently in the lineage was done with some AKG microphones and a Sony TCD5, which is very, very popular at the time, a great little recording machine. My personal favorite from that particular tour is June 21st in Los Angeles. It was a great recording done by Rex Hamilton that was recorded 8 rows behind the front of house mixing position. Also recorded on a TCD5 with some Sennheiser microphones. Not only is it a fantastic recording, it is a bitchin' performance. It is absolutely fantastic. The interplay between David Gilmour and Mick Ralphs on that particular show is just on another level.
I'm going to throw in a couple other ones because I dipped my toe in the water and listened to a bunch of Gilmour 84 shows in preparation for this podcast. There's a little run of shows near the end of May where there's 2 shows in Boston and there's 2 shows in Philadelphia. The Boston ones in particular are a really fun listen, and there's 2 really nice recordings. Both are recorder 2, I believe. The audience won't let them leave, so they actually do an extra encore on both nights. The first night they bring back There's No Way Out of Here and Gilmour makes some comment like, I guess we're not getting out of here tonight or something like that, and then goes into There's No Way Out of Here. And the second night in Boston, they break out I Can't Breathe Anymore, which, as Joe mentioned, was only played, I think, 7 times. Is that right? I can't remember. It's not that many. And then later in the week, May 29th, they're in Philadelphia at the Tower Theater, and another really, really nice recording, and I Can't Breathe Anymore is broken out again at that time. So all 3 of those shows, really, really fun listens. An early show that I was surprised I hadn't really paid much attention to is April 11th, 1984 at the Zenith in Paris, France. It's quite nice recording. It's also, I believe, featured on the Beyond the Floyd documentary that was in the official video release of this tour. There's some behind the scenes shots of them at the Zenith. So recommend all 4 of those shows.
When I listen to or watch the videos of the 84 tour, the first thing I see and realize is how good the mood was on stage and how positive everything was. I think after the most depressing experiences with the war life, it must have been feeling unlocked for David Gilmour, and the positivity on the stage is really exciting, to be honest.
I agree that they seem to be enjoying themselves, and for me it's a lot of parallels to the On an Island tour, where David seems to be good at picking people that can support him on stage and really understanding what he's trying to do and making sure that they support him, which you can see on the On an Island tour, which you couldn't see on the Rattle That Lock tour, in my opinion. And I also think that the About Face tour, even though he didn't like to be a guitar hero or a pop star or whatever, I think the tour and the experience of that tour gave him the confidence to continue working on what eventually became Momentary Lapse of Reason.
Going back to the kind of the vibe of the 1984 tour, it was really unique. To me, it seemed like it was the first time that David was really actually having a lot of fun on stage. And it was also interesting that if you listen to the recordings of that tour, it's interesting that Mick Ralphs seems to do a lot of the stage banter in those shows. I mean, it's a David Gilmour show. You would expect David Gilmour to take the lead and stuff, but I think David was just really happy to have somebody else just kind of do it. I think a lot of the carefree atmosphere on that tour was due to the fact that David was indulging in some substances during that time. And, there's stories of David after the shows, especially at the Kabuki Theater, which is only a 1,100 seat venue in San Francisco, which he played, I think, June 26th, if I'm not mistaken, just coming out and signing autographs after the show nonchalantly. I couldn't imagine seeing David Gilmour in 1984 and then he just walks out after the show and just starts signing autographs for people like it's no big deal. So yeah, there was definitely a different sort of side to David during this tour, and it shows in the performances. And yeah, that's part of why, for me, I absolutely love this tour. I truly do.
So about that 84 tour, could you tell us a little bit about the equipment itself he used at that time, Bjorn?
Yeah, as I mentioned, he's starting to use a lot of digital stuff. He's got a new pedal board, a lot of different Boss pedals, which is sort of a transition to the Momentary Lapse of Reason Delicate Sound Thunder tour. But I think one of perhaps the most important thing about his setup for that tour is the fact that he bought a lot of new guitars just prior to the tour. Phil Taylor, his technician, and David went up to the Fender warehouse in England in January '84 and bought a lot of new guitars. Some of them were the Candy Apple Red that he used for most of the 80s and 90s, which he didn't use on the '84 tour. The Cream one, that sort of became his main guitar for the tour, and also the first leg of the Momentary Lapse of Reason tour. If you want to go real minutia, the neck on the Cream one ended up on the Black Strat. And he bought a lot of other guitars as well, a couple of Telecasters, and also the 62 reissue guitar that he used on some of the guest appearances in 84, 85, 86. And what's interesting about these guitars is that they were the first guitars from the newly established Fender Custom Shop, or what became the Fender Custom Shop after Fender having been bought by CBS, and the quality declined throughout the 70s. So David buying a lot of new guitars in '84 was really the start of also Fender and as a new company, if you will, in the States. But also him wanting to not to have his older guitars with him on tour, including some of the guitars that he bought in 76, 77 around recording his first solo album and Animals, when he really started to collect and acquire a lot of vintage guitars. Interestingly, he brought with him the Black Strat, which I guess was considered more of a workhorse rather than a iconic guitar for him.
We're talking about those guitars who have been auctioned a few years back, I would say.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So then in 1986, David and Nick decided to go back to the studio to record a new Pink Floyd album. Do you think, Mike, that this was based on the fact that his solo career somehow stalled?
I don't really look at it that way. He sort of settles into this pattern of being a professional session man and special guest on live shows in '85, and you can tell that during this time he's still kind of trying to keep his brand or his image alive as a solo artist. On the 13th of July, '85, he appears at Live Aid as the only member of Pink Floyd to do so. He plays in Brian Ferry's band, and during this gig he meets a 20-year-old keyboardist named John Caron, which we can come back to later. Later in the year, he's special guest again. He's billed on the tickets and all the advertising as special guest for Pete Townshend's new band Deep End, which does do a very brief tour near the end of '85. As I mentioned earlier, they recorded an album called White City, a Novel, which Gilmour plays 2 tracks on, Give Blood and White City Fighting. If you're a Pete Townshend fan, I highly recommend that album. It's probably my favorite Pete Townshend solo album, I would say. Following the release of that album, they do a short tour. They play shows in Brixton Academy in London and at Caen in France. It's notable in these shows that Gilmour is given 2 songs to play solo material in the set list. So he plays Blue Light and Love on the Air in these shows, in each of the 3 shows that Deep End performed. So he is given this spotlight to continue to keep his solo career alive as if that is a going concern. And then in February, he plays what turns out to be the last real promotional show for About Face, which is the Colombian Volcano Appeal show at Royal Albert Hall. During the show, he's backed by a mixture of his About Face band. So Jody Lynn Scott's there, Mick Ralphs is there, and the Deep End band, which is sort of Pete Townshend's go-to crew, Rabbit Bundrick, Simon Phillips, Chucho Marchan. And during the show, where he only plays 5 songs, he plays 3 from About Face, including You Know You're Right, Out of the Blue, and no, not Out of the Blue. Am I wrong about that? Out of the Blue, I think, and Blue Light again. So he's still pushing his solo career as late as February of '86. And when he gets moving on his next project, it seems to have been initially conceived as a solo album. Nick Mason doesn't really appear until later in '86, and I think it's around that time that they start to shift the focus from it being Gilmour's next solo album to maybe seeing if there is a Pink Floyd album that can be made out of this. There's multiple session musicians and writers that are brought in, and it isn't until late '86 that it starts to be referred to as the next Pink Floyd project, famously instigating Waters to pursue legal action when he found out that that was the case. Even with Pink Floyd starting to take shape again in early '87, Gilmour makes two, I think, notable solo appearances. One is he appears in March '87 at the Secret Policeman's Ball for a wonderful performance of Running Up That Hill with Kate Bush. I highly recommend checking that one out on YouTube. And maybe Bjorn will have something to say about the guitar he uses in that performance, because it's quite unique. Additionally, he plays December 12th in an episode of Saturday Night Live as the musical guest, where he performs a sort of jam with the house band called either Song for My Sarah or Robertson It's You, depending on who you ask. I think he uses the same guitar again in that performance, if I'm not mistaken, but I could be. So he's still doing solo things, but it's slowly sort of going into the background as Pink Floyd takes its shape again in 1987.
So Bjorn, what guitar did he use? I want to know.
On the Secret Policeman's?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a Steinberger. It's a GL3T that apparently was customized to David Gilmour specifications from the factory, including the trem arm system and the EMG pickups that he had just installed on his cream or blonde Strat and the candy apple red Strat. And the guitar was also used. It was his main guitar for the Momentary sessions.
Okay, great. So the Momentary sessions, as you mentioned, Mike, they were totally different because everything was on a much bigger scale. Many people involved also in composing and writing and everything. It seems somehow I would have loved to have that album as a David Gilmour solo album with less 80s technical approach. The whole Pink Floyd scale and everything would have been very interesting. But either way, we talked in another episode. We talked a lot about that album, so we won't do that again, but I would like to briefly talk about the 87 to 89 tour, because to me it's a tour I like very much. And I was at a show in 89 in Cologne, and I don't know if I'm totally wrong, Bjorn, on that, but I really feel that playing A Momentary Lapse of Reason live brought back a little bit of the old David Gilmour. I mean, his playing live in 87 to 89, in my opinion, was some sort of his peak guitar playing.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason is him wanting to cover a lot of the older sounds, trying to make sure that the songs are as true to the original as possible. You can see him reintroducing a lot of the older pedals, but still the main setup that is using for at least the 87 and 88 leg of the tour is basically the same setup he used on the 84 About Face tour. Obviously different guitars, and but yeah, I think I agree. That period, especially the 88, 89 leg of the tour is perhaps my favorite as well, at least from the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, it seems as he was so very confident about his playing at that time, finally, and so he was so very good. But let's go back to the late 80s, early 90s. After that big world tour, which was something like 300 shows they did, they had one more in 1990. First, of course, Venice 89, and then Knebworth in 1990, and then we come to the most famous Ecomundo show in 1992. Joe.
Well, Ecomundo 92 was pretty interesting. It was December 4th, 1992. The whole idea was kind of conceived by Chucho Marchand, which David had met through Pete Townsend's band. And by all accounts, that show was an absolute disaster. Basically, Ecomundo, as I understand it, was an environmentalist sort of group that approached Chucho Merchan to put on a benefit concert to support environmental awareness, something that at that time was kind of a radical idea, but now, with climate change, it's certainly more in the public consciousness. Basically, the concert was to be a charity event, and by all accounts, Ecomundo, according to Chucho Merchan, were wolves in environmentalist clothing. They had absolutely no intention of using the money that was raised from this event for environmental awareness. The show was a disaster because the PA was inadequate. Half the musicians that were due to show up didn't show up. This was right at a time where Colombia was right at the height of the Pablo Escobar sort of drama. A lot of people, public officials, police were being assassinated. And when the idea for this event came up, Steve O'Rourke, David's manager, was absolutely against it. He didn't want David to show up. But Chucho Merchan approached David. David said he would do it, so David honored his word, as he historically has done for these sorts of things. Roger Daltrey, Phil Manzanera also showed up. David played You Know I'm Right, where the power cut out, I think, 2 verses into the show. And they had to stop, they had to start again, and they managed to kind of hobble their way through the show. David played On the Turning Away, Run Like Hell, Comfortably Numb. It's one of the rare moments where David performs both, or basically all the lyrics for Comfortably Numb, commonly referred to as the dark section and the light section, which is quite interesting to listen to. It's interesting that David didn't return to South America until 2015, and rumor has it that his experience during this show was largely responsible for that. During the 90s, a lot of his peers were touring South America. After the Pablo Escobar regime, things had changed quite a bit. The Rolling Stones played South America. A lot of people were touring South America, but David resisted for a long time until 2015, largely due to his experiences during this event. There were threats from the mob that this show shouldn't go on because they were concerned that the stage being built in the stadium that they performed in was going to affect the grass that was in the field, and that was somehow going to affect the game of a football match that was supposed to happen, and they were totally against it, so they sent in death threats to Chucho Merchan. It was absolute chaos, and apparently a couple days after the show, when Chucho Merchan and his some of the musicians, I don't know if David was a part of this, but Chucho Merchan and some of his musicians that had performed during the show were leaving the Hilton hotel that they were staying in. They were cornered in by police, and they were basically mugged. They were refused to leave the hotel until Chucho Merchan basically paid them out of his own pocket. And the whole experience was just really, really terrible. Apparently, Chucho was in debt for 15 years after the events, and the whole thing was just an absolute disaster. There was feedback during the show. There was power failure, and just left a really, really bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. And it's really too bad because the whole point of bringing these people to Colombia was to show these people that Colombians are not just a bunch of drug dealers and so forth, that the country is really beautiful, and that was the end result, and it's too bad. But if you listen to the performances from David during that show, it's actually, the performances are really good. It's one of my favorite performances of On the Turning Away.
Yeah.
And a rare version of Comfortably Numb. So despite all of the issues that they incurred during that show, there was still a lot that was worthwhile. Fortunately, there is a recording that exists. There's a 1-camera video recording that exists. Originally, there was a 4-camera crew there that filmed the entire show. And in early 1993, the producers of the footage, for whatever reason, decided that it was unusable, so they basically destroyed everything. And somebody on the crew took the initiative to salvage the center sort of center stage reel of footage, and so there is a bit that exists, and thank God that it does, because it's a pretty good performance despite all of its handicaps.
Yeah, I mean, when you say it was a pretty good performance, despite all the circumstances, it is something that happens to Pink Floyd again and again and again. The more complicated it gets, the better they are. This was already started in the late 60s and up to the 94.
Yeah, and that's I was actually discussing this with a friend of mine a couple of days ago, and it's interesting to observe how David seemed to respond to failures. Some of my favorite shows from the 77 tour is when his pedal board isn't working for some reason, and the solo that comes straight after a pedal malfunctioning is always some of his best playing. There was a couple of instances on the on an island tour when I saw him, when there was some feedback issues, his guitar wasn't working, there was some communication stuff between the sound guy and David, and immediately after, he seems to be having this surge of energy and play some of his best stuff. So it's really interesting. I was watching the 92 clip the other day, and I definitely agree that his playing is surprisingly good, despite all the issues they had. And an interesting detail about that show is it's difficult to see the setup because of the lack of footage, but behind them you can see two Fender 1959 basements, as far as I can tell, and standing on top of two hi-wats. And this is really minutiae stuff, but this is the same setup he used on the Division Bell recording sessions.
I think we've officially also talked about this show more than anybody in the history of the world. But I also want to say I love this show because this is the last time he plays anything from About Face. I don't think he's played a single song from About Face since this show. And I always found it interesting. Why did he choose to play You Know I'm Right in this show? And I actually think the reason is pretty simple. I think he was looking for material that Chucho Merchan knew how to play. And he had played with him on this song, and I think it's a relatively simple structure, but you can see him even during the performance, he's looking at the other musicians while he's playing and sort of raising the neck of his guitar every time there's a break or a switch to the verse to a chorus or whatever. So they're learning on the fly as well, but that's what makes it really fun.
Yeah, I think that performance has the world's most inept drummer, because if you watch the clip of On the Turning Away, where he goes into solo and it shifts tempo, David's literally motioning to him to like double time, and it takes the drummer a few seconds to catch on, and he finally gets on, and it really cooks from there. And rumor has it that after all of the failures that they had during that show, David refused to accept payment for that show. And Chucho was very concerned that everybody involved, because of the disaster of the show, they were all going to hate him. But we know that's not the case, because David invited him back for the 2001 shows. And I think that really goes to show the character of David Gilmour, to look past those sorts of things and, honor his commitment.
So after an hour of talking about that show, let's move on to 93, where they started recording the Division Bell, and we briefly already talked about it, and we won't talk too long about it. But Bjorn, am I wrong if I say that David, during the recording sessions on his boat for the Division Bell, found his final setup, his final gear he used for almost decades until 2024?
Yeah, pretty much, yeah. He seems to go back to more of a vintage tone, if you will, using a lot of his older pedals and some reissue stuff. And I think it may be part of him wanting to recreate something from his past and going into Division Bell as a Pink Floyd project. But also, this was also the time when smaller pedal companies started to appear, making clones and boutique versions of older classics and stuff. So he's very much into that whole thing of going back. I mean, if you look at the rock scene at the time, you have bands like Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, and everyone is trying to capture the sound of the 70s, which I think is what David also was trying to do in some way. But he's also using a lot of the stuff that he's been using since 84, the guitars and a lot of the effects, and also some of the amps as well, and also in blending more of the 70s stuff with the 80s stuff, and which turns into something new, I guess, in the 90s. And it's also bits and pieces of this setup is also something that is using on all the guest appearances that he did in the early 90s, which sort of ends up being the basis for his setup on the Meltdown shows in 2001.
Okay, so given the fact that we talked about the 1994 tour on the other episode, I would like to jump directly to the A Day for Tibet show in 1996, Mike. I know that he played a song again there he never played before.
That's right. So this was a Day for Tibet, and it was a benefit show for the Dalai Lama. It was at Alexandra Palace in London on July 20th, 96. And it was the first time that any member of Pink Floyd had played a Syd Barrett solo song, and it's David performs Terrapin at this show. This show is pretty underdocumented, and I only wanted to mention it because back in the late 90s, it was sort of a holy grail for me as a collector to find a recording of this show. And I do believe a recording exists based off of conversations I had back then, but it's definitely not circulating. There are a few pictures of Gilmour at this show, but yeah, this is a very interesting show that I would love to hear one day.
So after that, he just did nothing for a few years. And he arrived on the stage back in 2001 for doing some specific acoustic shows. Mike, tell us a little more about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's the first show was June 22nd, 2001. It was for Robert Wyatt's Meltdown Festival. Pretty different type of show for Gilmour than he's done in the past. It was largely acoustic. He'd done a bunch of reworking of Pink Floyd songs, as well as some very, very interesting and diverse cover songs, which I think are quite lovely. Namely Richard Thompson's The Dimming of the Day. I absolutely love that version of that song that he does at Meltdown and in 2002 and the subsequent tours. He closes the show with a song called Hushabye Mountain from the film Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, which is, again, had anyone ever heard of that song before then? I hadn't, but I love these shows, and I love the reworkings. I think most notably in these 2001, 2002 shows, though, is the return of Rick Wright. And he comes back to join the band and play a solo song of his for the first time live ever in a version of Breakthrough from Broken China. So lots to like here. Also, Gilmour premieres a new solo song for the first time in close to 20 years, with Smile making its debut at these shows. So there's a lot here that is very, very interesting. And it was a tour of sorts. They did the show in June 2001 for Meltdown, and then they did 3 shows at the Royal Festival Hall in January 2002, and 2 more in Paris later in January. This show was released on DVD. I highly recommend anyone to seek it out.
It must have been very different for David just to rearrange everything fitting to the more or less acoustic setups. And as I know, as I remember from the documentary, he rehearsed most of it on his boat. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so. And the pedal board that he's using was the first of many new Pete Cornish board. Pete Cornish did the boards for Animals and The Wall. And it was specially designed with, obviously with effects and a lot of tubes and being very analog and classic. But they also made some custom units for David to do certain stuff for these shows, including the intro on Shine On You Crazy Diamond, where he's looping what Wright did on keyboards. He's using a sort of a sweep technique with a lot of delays, and he's playing on top of that. So they had to create a custom unit for him to do that. He's also playing acoustic guitars through that board using the pedals that you would more conventionally use with electric guitar. So there's a lot of interesting stuff about that setup, and again, it's sort of a transition between Division Bell and On an Island as well. And I was lucky to be at one of the Royal Festival Hall shows, actually the one with Richard Wright, and I remember sitting. We had some really terrible seats up in the choir, but you could hear the floor squeaking when they moved around on the stage. It was really special, and David was really nervous. I remember looking at his fingers, and I think you can see it on the DVD as well. He was terrified up on that stage, but it was a really unconventional way of performing old classics, and in some way perhaps a bit groundbreaking as well in terms of how he used his equipment. And again, as Pink Floyd did in the 70s, they created custom units for him to be able to get the sounds that he wanted.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that about him being nervous, because it's something I wanted to ask you. Because when I watched the video again, and I remember watching the video for the first time and watching him, the way he moves on the stage, the way he's giving musical cues to the guys and just moving around, he does not seem very confident in what he's doing. Maybe it's because it's such a different setup or everything. Maybe it's because the musicians who are there are so good and he feels somehow unsecure just having his guitar. I don't really know what it is, because we come back to that later. But in 2006, it was the total opposite. He felt really comfortable. I, at least, felt that way.
Yeah, eventually he did. I remember seeing some shows early on the 2006 tour, and he definitely wasn't confident at that point.
Mm-hmm.
He was very concerned about everything happening on stage, and he seemed to be a bit out of place, which is quite the opposite when we saw him later on that tour in Albert Hall. He was really getting into it, and I think you can see that on the Pink Floyd tours of the 80s and 90s as well. He definitely needs some time to get confident and not having to worry about everything. I'm not sure why, but he seems to be struggling a bit with his confidence and as a musician and the talent that he really has.
Yes. When I did the episode with John Edgerton about the Syd Barrett documentaries he did, and he also told me that having David Gilmour sitting there for more than 4 hours, being really nice and polite, talking about Syd, that he was so shy and wasn't really full of confidence. And after that interview, John told me that David asked him if it was okay, if he was capable to articulate himself well enough and everything. And it's really interesting. I mean, he had the same interview a few days later with Roger Waters, and he felt like a king. And it's so funny that David Gilmour, I don't know what was happening at the time with him, because I mean, after 500 most successful Pink Floyd shows, you should feel confident about what you're doing. But later on, I think that changed, but it's still in the early 2000s. It's interesting.
Yeah, and I think also history repeated itself with the Meltdown shows. If you look at the way the About Face era started, he came off being part of Pink Floyd. There were several years with very little activity, and suddenly he had to stand on his own. And between 94 and 2001, there was more or less the same situation. I remember when we got tickets for the Meltdown shows, we pretty much bought them on the same day. And there wasn't really much fuss about those shows. And again, in 2006, he came off a very long period of very little activity. And I also remember reading Phil Masnera, who sort of coached him on the 2006 recording sessions. He really had to kicking him around to make that album. So yeah, he seems more confident now. But back in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, he seemed to be struggling a bit.
Yeah. So, Joe, let's talk a little bit about On the Island. I mean, why did it take so long to have another album out?
Well, David has gone on record saying that his relationship with his first wife and his first kids during the height of Pink Floyd's popularity got entirely fucked up. And he didn't want to repeat the same mistake that he made with his second wife and his new kids. You know, the second half of the 90s and the early 2000s, you know, he had 3 new kids, babies. And he wanted to be there as a father figure. And I think that had a huge part in why it took so long for him to do another album. And finally in 2006, we got it with On an Island. And the recording of that album started as far back as 2001 with the song Smile, which appears on the On an Island album. The album started off kind of like most Pink Floyd projects. It was little bits and pieces that kind of he recorded over the years and then kind of molded together to come up with some rough ideas. In 2004, David enlisted the help of Phil Manzanera to kind of sort through those bits and pieces to see what fit together and kind of what didn't work with kind of what he was feeling at that time in his life. And initially, David rounded up Phil Manzanera, Jules Holland, Krist Stanton, who was a big fixture in Eric Clapton's band for a number of years. And also, I think he enlisted the help of a man named Nick France and Bob Close. And what they did was they kind of formed a little bit of a jazz band, and they went into Studio 1 at Abbey Road, and what they did was they put a curtain up in Studio 1, which is a massive recording space. They put a giant curtain up to kind of reduce it down to a third of what the overall size was, and they just kind of jammed. And then they threw some ideas down on tape with Andy Jackson. And then David booked a second session in Studio 2 at Abbey Road, which is the famous Beatles recording space. And that was a little bit more of a rock and roll type band. It was Guy Pratt, Andy Newmark, Phil Manzanera. They threw down some ideas, which ultimately became the title track of the On an Island album. And then they kind of broke up for holiday, and during that holiday David kind of listened back and he really kind of didn't like what he heard, and so him and Andy Jackson decided to go back to the demos. And ultimately what the On an Island album is kind of a composite of the sessions from Studio 1, Studio 2 at Abbey Road, the demos, and then some overdubs from numerous musicians that guested on the album. And that's basically what the finished product is, essentially, is a massive editing job between 2 big sessions and then a lot of little sessions after that. Ultimately, the album was recorded at Abbey Road, the Sussex Farmhouse, and the Astoria. David Crosby and Graham Nash made an appearance, which is kind of a high-profile sort of thing for David. The orchestral scores were recorded at Abbey Road. The album was produced by David, Phil Manzanera, and Chris Thomas. The album was engineered by Andy Jackson. Chris Thomas was sort of brought in at the very last stretch of the album to kind of bring home everything that was done and kind of give it focus and give it a direction. And apparently his biggest criticism of the album was that it was too mellow. But David ultimately said, this is what I want. This is what I'm going to do. Either take it or leave it. And Krist decided to stay on board with the project. And now we have the On an Island album.
Yeah, I have to admit that I'm not a big fan of that album. I like a few tracks, but to me, it is too mellow. I would even say a little bit too soft and too clean, which somehow led to the most stupid thing I did, which was not buying a ticket for the 2006 tour, which in my opinion is one of the best tour he did in his entire life. Even I like his recent tour very, very much.
Yeah, I'll agree. I think the album is a little too laid back. I saw the tour April 16th, 2006 with my mom and my dad. We flew from Portland, Oregon to Oakland just shy of my 18th birthday to go see the tour. And yeah, it was a really special thing. I mean, getting to hear Echoes, What's of the Deal, all of that was really cool.
Yeah, I mean, at that time I lived on a hill, and I went for a walk, and I heard David Gilmour playing Echoes live, just like 10 or 8 kilometers away on a stage I knew, on a place I knew, and I was so angry about myself. And at that point, I decided not to miss any show of any member of Pink Floyd at any time anymore. Mike?
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of this tour too. I would go so far as to say I think this is the best solo tour that any Pink Floyd member has done. I was lucky. I went to see both shows at Massey Hall in Toronto, April of 06. Very small venue, 100-year-old building, something like that. It's a really cool place to see a show. I always think of this tour like Pink Floyd Light. It had a lot of the elements of the 90s band. So obviously Rick Wright's there, John Caron's there, Guy Pratt's there, Gilmour, much more intimate, but just as powerful. Great light show. And what a wonderful set list. Like just amazing. Echoes, What's the Deal, Wearing the Inside Out. It goes on. And I think all those mellow On an Island tracks actually translate a lot better live. Take a Breath's probably the hardest hitting track on that album. And I think live it's pretty rockin'. I really enjoy Where We Start as well. I think even though it's a mellowish song, it's a nice closer and winds down the album quite well. And in the show, it winds down the first set quite nicely before they go into the Pink Floyd set in the second half of the show.
Yeah, I mean, Mike, you hit the nail on the head. That tour was absolutely fantastic. Some interesting performances from that tour. March 16th was the kind of the one-off with Sam Brown. They did Grey Gig in the Sky. April 16th and 17th. April 16th, I got to see that show. Thanks, Mom. Thanks, Dad. And then on the 17th, they decided to do Arnold Layne, just out of nowhere, which is really, really cool. I think it's the first time that David's ever really performed that live. Am I mistaken?
At that time, I would say correct.
Yeah. And then, of course, you have the Royal Albert Hall run with David Bowie decides to appear, which was one of his last public performances before he passed away. Then on the 31st of May, you had Nick Mason and Richard Wright showed up. And then the tour finished in August 26th in Gdansk, Poland. And just an epic tour, absolutely fantastic. And it's really sad that we didn't get more from that band, because I get the feeling that had Richard Wright not passed away, that band probably would have stayed as it was for a while, and they probably would have done more into the future.
Yeah, I just loved in the summer. It felt like after the Royal Albert Hall shows, they added that summer leg through Europe because they just didn't want to stop. It wasn't originally planned, and then all of a sudden those shows, if you remember back to that time, it was that they were announced very close to the dates, and they played a lot of historic and interesting venues, Castle Clam in Austria, St. Mark's Square in Venice, and those shows in particular even got more interesting. They added Astronomy Domine to the set list. Syd Barrett had passed away prior to that last leg, and Gilmour does Dark Globe in 2 shows, which was later released as a B-side to the Arnold Layne single. So I just think that band was really on fire, and you could tell they didn't want it to end. And I agree with you. If Rick hadn't passed away, I think they very much would have continued.
Yeah, if you watched the documentary on Remember That Night on the Blu-ray or DVD, and you see the relationship between David and Rick at that time, I think they were just really, really friends at that time. And I remember that David was mocking Rick for being a little bit cocky on one song, and he should behave himself and everything. And I really think they were more than partners at that time, but really friends for maybe even for the first time. And I think we should not underestimate the importance of Rick during that show and being part of all that. Bjorn, the complete tour in 2006, how that evolved between the beginning in 2006, even the Royal Albert Hall shows, and then in the end the orchestral version in Gdansk in 2007. I mean, the development musically as well as technically was really exciting. I mean, I remember one show in Vienna where we have a recording from the version from Echoes on that show, and High Hopes. It was just so brilliant, and everyone is calm and everything's it just were perfect shows.
Yeah, and I have to say that whole period is very special for me. I was working at EMI at the time, so I got to follow the whole process of the making the album, and I got to hear the album a few weeks before it came out, and I saw him several times on the tour, and it was really a special period. And I definitely agree with you that it's my favorite solo tour of his in so many ways. And again, going back to him needing some time to become confident, I think you can see that from the early shows, also having seen him in Europe at the time, and how the tour develops into something that's more Pink Floyd, as you mentioned. And it's funny to see how the other technicians, and I think it was Mark Brickman, wasn't it, that designed some of the shows, and how they sort of encourage and push him to get bigger and better, I think. And when you come to the Albert Hall shows, there's really a different man on that stage. And I was lucky to see all three shows in May, and yeah, it was really special. And in terms of gear, it is also a interesting period, because he's going back to some of his older stuff, and he starts out with the Candy Apple Red 1983 57 reissue Strat that he's been using in the 80s and 90s. But perhaps inspired by the Live 8 show in 2005, the year before, he also used the black Strat again, which for me was a huge thing at the time. And as the tour progresses, he sort of retires the red Strat, which is perhaps him saying goodbye to his 80s and 90s self, I guess. And he's also bringing out a lot of different guitars from the early days. And one thing that really, again, if you want to go minutiae, one thing that really caught my attention was the rehearsals for the Albert Hall shows in May, where he's bringing out the 59 Telecaster Custom that he used for Dogs. Unfortunately, he didn't use it. He decided to get a custom shop Telecaster instead that was especially made for him and flown to the arena. But that would have been something, and to see both the Black Strat and the 59 Custom up on that stage. And I also have to agree with you that obviously the high point was seeing Rick and hearing Echoes, but I also have to say that perhaps my high point on that tour was hearing Wearing the Inside Out.
Yeah, That's true. I mean, it's a wonderful song, and the rendition they did it is just a great tour. And I mean, luckily we have many different recordings of that and many different shows, and you can really listen and hear the difference between the shows in the early stage of the tour and later stages, and then finally in Gdansk. And yeah, that's I would say his most successful tour he did, or even one of the best, I think. So we move on to 2008, if you all agree, for a very short one-time appearance or two-time appearance together with Ron Geesin, doing Atom Heard Mother once again, which is really interesting to hear. And when we spoke to Lee Harris, he told us that this performance was the initial version he used to create their own Nick Mason Social for Secrets rendition of Atom Heard Mother. The guitar he played there gave Lee the idea how to play the guitar on his tour and his versions. And it's a very nice rendition. If you compare it to the other guitarists who did, or the guitarist who did the Atom Heard Mother, it's night and day. And not being, how do I say it? If you listen to Comfortably Numb, for example, I just don't see the point to listen to Comfortably Numb from Roger Waters' solo tour, for example. Even though, you know, they're great guitarists, but there's just no reason to do that. And if you listen to that 2008 Atom Heard Mother guitar in comparison to any other guitarist, you know what the difference is immediately. You need 1 minute and see, okay, that's David Gilmour. For example, Lee Harris mentioned Nick Mason, that his right hi-hat, he can hear it like he needs 2 bars and he knows it's Nick Mason. And I think it's the same for David Gilmour. Nobody can really copy that. So at the same year, in 2008, there was one appearance at the Jools Holland show for tributing Richard Wright, who recently died. And they played Remember a Day. And I remember the first time I saw that, and I saw the interview after that. If you see David Gilmour, first of all, the song and the version is really nice they play. But also David Gilmour is not really known as somebody being too emotional, I would say. And you can really see that he's fighting. He's fighting, talking about Richard Wright and explaining. And he explained it so well, saying that Richard Wright was the glue for the band and tributing that. And I'm really angry and sad and a little bit pissed about Roger Waters not being able, even after that time, to somehow acknowledge what Richard Wright, how important he was and everything. For everyone who did not see that, check out YouTube and check out Remember a Day from 2008, Richard Wright tribute on the Jools Holland show. So let's move on. We're already almost 2 hours in. Let's move on to Rattle That Lock in 2015. In my opinion, a much more personal album than On an Island. I like it much more, to be honest, but Joe.
For me, Rattle That Lock is my second favorite David Gilmour project that he's ever done. I don't necessarily consider it his best, but for me personally, where I was in my life at that time, I hold that album in incredibly high regards and makes me very happy every time I hear it. But that album started off like most other David Gilmour Pink Floyd projects. It was just a bunch of bits and pieces that David Gilmour had recorded. Once again, he enlisted the help of Phil Manzanera to sort through the quote-unquote, as David has coined the term, the rubbish library, to pick through and find bits and pieces that kind of work together and come up with sort of some rough ideas for an album. One thing I'm not sure of is this is really kind of an interesting time because, the Endless River and the timeline of the Endless River and Rattle That Lock, I'm not sure how they kind of line up. I'm not sure if the Endless River was happening, and then he decided to make a solo album, or how that really works. But regardless, the two of them, in terms of the timeline, line up pretty quickly. Most of the material for Rattle That Lock was written between 2010 and 2015. Small little bit goes back to as far back as 1997, which was the music for A Boat Lies Waiting. But the bulk of the album was recorded at David's new Medina studio in Brighton, as well as his Sussex farmhouse and the Astoria. Orchestral pieces were recorded at Air Studios. Album was engineered by Andy Jackson and Damon Idens. Interestingly, Damon Idens is the son of Langley Idens, who you can see in the backdrop films for Signs of Life and On the Run from the 1987 to 1989 tour. And the cast of musicians is pretty similar to what he had for On an Island. The core band was Steve DeZanislau, Andy Newmark, Guy Pratt, Jules Holland, Bob Close. And then it's kind of the first time that one of David's kids sort of makes an appearance in his musical life. Gabriel Gilmour played piano in Any Tongue. We also had John Caron. We had a return from Crosby and Nash, Phil Manzanero, Robert Wyatt, and a whole bunch of others. Album was released on September 18th. On an Island went to number 1 in the UK, and Rattle That Lock went to number 1 in the UK. And Rattle That Lock went to number 5 in the top US 200. So On an Island and Rattle That Lock, in terms of an album and its success, did pretty damn well. Not bad.
So he went on tour with that album. And to be honest, for me personally, it's a strange tour. I saw him live in Oberhausen in 2015. And I have to admit, I was not excited. It was a little bit flat somehow. I was most excited about him playing Money, which says a lot. And I can't really explain what I did not really like. What I know for sure what I didn't like was the back films, because he just used the 94 films again, at least for the German leg. I don't know if he did it on the whole tour. But these films with the guys with the long wooden legs and everything were quite okay in 94, and I quite liked them at that time. But in 2015, it seemed so old, out of time and old-fashioned, and I just had the feeling, and I might be really wrong about that, I just had the feeling that he did not invest too much in that tour, at least the first half of it.
Yeah, I saw 2 shows on this tour, both in Toronto again, March 31st, 2016 and April 1st, 2016. It was in a sports arena, so not as cool of a venue as 06. I'm sort of like you. The shows fell a bit flat for me. He wasn't as risk-taking in his set list. I found some of the selections to be a little bit vanilla. I remember I was excited for What Do You Want From Me, just because that was something that wasn't played in 06, but I'm not a huge fan of that song. I think that album is pretty good, and I like some of the songs from the album live, especially A Boat Lies Waiting, Faces of Stone, and In Any Tongue. Those are all great songs live. However, Girl in the Yellow Dress is by far the worst thing that Gilmour's put out, in my opinion. And it drags the show to an absolute crawl in the middle of the set, which I am not a huge fan of. I do not know why that was added to the set. I'm fine with it being on the album. But yeah, in comparison to 2006, I just found it a bit disappointing. I enjoyed seeing Gilmour live again, but I found that tour to be a little bit sterile.
Yeah, I think Mike says what I'm thinking. Girl in the Yellow Dress says it all for me. That that album and that tour is my least favorite of anything that David's done. And I think the struggle for me is on the album. I'm having trouble with it being too much of a family album. and this was prior to the pandemic, but there's something about the vibe on the album that puts me off. And also the tour, I think, compared to, it's night and day for me compared to the On an Island tour. Some of the musicians are the same, but it's also using a lot of musicians, or some musicians that's not there seemingly to support him. Perhaps they're just too professional, but it doesn't appear to be a band. And I remember seeing him in a couple of nights in Albert Hall, and I was thinking, is this a band, or is this a gathering of really strong personalities? And again, some of the songs, like Girl in the Yellow Dress, just dragged the show to a halt. And half the arena was going to the toilet or getting a beer. So, and me included. So I really don't have much positive to say about that album or tour.
Yeah, so I mean, something happened at that tour we're going to talk about now, which, in my opinion, did not happen too often. Joe, what happened?
I'm not sure anybody really knows for sure what happened. I mean, the tour started September 5th. They did a bunch of dates. They took a 2-month break, went to South America, did 6 dates, then stopped for Christmas. They did another American leg. And then in between 2016 or March of 2016 and I think it was July of 2016, I remember reading on social media that the band lineup had changed, and I remember thinking, what the fuck? Like, really? And they said that John Caron was no longer in the band, Phil Manzanera was no longer in the band, and Kevin MacLeod was no longer in the band either. And I remember thinking, like, what? Really? And they were replaced with Chester Kamen, Chuck Leavell, and Greg Phillinganes. And I had tickets for the first Pompeii show and tickets for the last 3 Royal Albert Hall shows in 2016. And I was really, really suspicious, like, what's going on? And I don't think anybody really knows the reason for the lineup change, but I think listening to the recordings of the 2015 show and having been to 3 of those shows, I think the answer is pretty obvious, that David just wasn't happy with the band. They just weren't gelling. There was something going on. And if you listen to the difference between the 2015 and 2016 shows, I mean, the difference was night and day. I mean, I think Chester Kamen really gave David a kick in the ass, which he really needed. I don't think Phil Manzanera challenges David in a musical capacity whatsoever in terms of guitar playing. And having the addition of Chester Kamen and somebody like Chuck Leavell and Greg Phillinganes really gave that band the shot in the arm that they needed. And the last 3 dates of the Royal Albert Hall were some of the best playing that I think David has ever done, specifically the 29th and the 30th of September 2016 were absolutely fantastic. I mean, seriously, some of the best playing that he's ever done. And yeah, I just think it's too bad that it took him that long to figure it out, that the first band that he put together just wasn't gelling.
I know that Guy Pratt once said the complete band was fired for a moment, even him, and then somehow he got back. And I remember that wherever it was, David Gilmour stated that he did not want to play with the Pink Floyd cover band anymore. And I think that totally fits to the idea and to the problem.
I think John Caron, kind of had, I think that comment was kind of directed at John Caron. There's a lot of sort of rumors being passed around the Floyd community. There's a lot of bad blood between him and John Caron and his work with Roger Waters. Since kind of getting the boot from David's band, there's been a lot of social media posts from John Caron suggesting certain things. And, John Caron, as far as I understand it, had a reputation as far back as the Momentary Lapse of Reason tour as just being kind of a difficult person. And I think that Pink Floyd cover band comment was directed straight at him. Again, I have no proof, but that's just my gut feeling.
I also would like to talk about one thing which happened during the Pompeii shows. One guy in the audience yelled, "Echoes, play Echoes." And David Gilmour got quite snappy about it and said, "Yeah, we won't play Echoes because Echoes was a dialogue between Richard and me, and Richard is not around anymore, so we won't play it ever again." And it's a very small moment, but it's, I think, a very important moment because it really describes, in my opinion, how David felt about all that and not being with Rick anymore musically.
I was at the first Pompeii show, July 7th, 2016.
Wow.
I flew there with my really good friend Chad and my then girlfriend Julia from Argentina. And it wasn't just one guy, it was the entire audience was chanting, "Echoes, echoes, echoes." I mean, literally everyone. And I remember David made that statement about not playing Echoes shortly before that show. And I could tell visibly he was standing on stage while the entire audience was chanting Echoes. And you could tell that he was pissed. He was not happy. And I thought it was kind of just really, you could tell it was a very cringy moment.
I'm sure it was amazing to be at that show, first of all, so I'm not trying to diminish that, but I do feel like at times that Pompeii show was a wasted opportunity. I feel like it was a really cool venue, but they didn't really do anything special, in my opinion, and that felt like the moment where they really should have done something. I'm not saying Echoes, I mean, and it's cool they were playing One of These Days, which I think was a little bit of a nod back to the original Pompeii show, but I often look at that show as a missed opportunity.
I agree. I mean, the first performance, which is the only one that I got, if you listen to he played the 7th and the 8th, you listen to the two shows, the 8th was much better, but in the context of that entire tour, the 2016 tour, it was either one of those shows weren't really the best performances on that tour. There were no special sort of guests. I agree. I felt like it was a wasted opportunity. I was really glad to see it, and I had a great time, but not the best show I saw on that tour, but still had an absolute blast. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I mean, on one side, I really understand the audience. If you're back in Pompeii and Echoes got born in Pompeii, so to speak, I understand that. But on the other hand, I mean, I don't really get it because at least the Italian fans are so well knowledged and they know everything about Pink Floyd. And of course, he would not do that. So I don't really understand why they just did not stop asking for it, because it must have been so annoying. And at least listen to the bootlegs. Of course, it got all perfectly edited in the official release. But if you listen to the two bootlegs, the whole mood of the two shows is not really good. I mean, if you compare that to the Royal Albert shows where he did the fantastic versions of Fat Old Son and everything, it seems as the Pompeii shows, he just wanted to get them done. He just wanted to get out of there. At least feels to me like that.
Maybe the mistake, if you will, was him mentioning beforehand that he wouldn't play the song. And maybe he could have avoided. I mean, he must have been expecting people to want him to play Echoes. So maybe it was a mistake on his part to talk about it beforehand. Otherwise, I would imagine that people would just think that, well, he's going to close with Echoes anyway. So
before the show, if you remember, in the '94 tour, they had the soundscape sort of ambient track that was playing over the PA. Before the show. They had the same thing for those shows, and there was the little ping from Echoes, and it was kind of baiting the audience a little bit. And so I think that might have given some people a little bit of false hope that maybe he was going to play it. So maybe that was a little bit of a mistake, getting people excited for something that wasn't going to happen. So I remember hearing that, and I remember reading that comment from David that he wasn't going to play it again shortly before the Pompeii shows. And I remember hearing that, and I remember thinking, like, it's a little misleading, like, to get people excited and then not play it.
Yeah. might be really true. So let's skip to 2024 to the new album Luck and Strange, which is very interesting. It's a total new approach. In my opinion, it's the total and final cut off to any Pink Floyd. He got a new producer, a very young producer, who is the producer of All J, for example, and did really great albums and really great sounds. And there's an interview where he said, David Gilmour said that he asked this producer, or Polly told him to ask the producer, because he was so keen working with him. And he said that, yeah, but there are two things I would like to ask you: no more solos and no more fading out songs, which is funny because it is David Gilmour's style, having that second half of the song, having that long solo and then fading out the song. And he said, no, we won't have that. It's still on the album, but anyway, it took me quite a while to like that album. I like it very much now, but I had to listen to it because I really wanted to like it. I had to listen to it like 50 times. It did not touch me the very first times. Bjorn, how do you see it musically? Is it so much different as I think it is?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think it was important for him to make an album that both inspired him and pushed him artistically and musically, and working with other people that's challenging him in some way, especially the producer, which is a bold move, I think. Him being, well, he's nearly 80, isn't he? So it's quite the opposite for me. I was pretty negative about the Rattle That Lock album, but this album is perhaps for me his best since the 78 solo album. And the reason why is, for me at least, I can hear that he's having fun recording it. I can sit down and listen to the album and hear that he's really enjoying the process of recording and writing this album. And as a musician myself, I can really recognize that in the music, and also how he talks about writing and producing the album. And it sounds so much more relaxed, so much more organic, and so much more inspired than Rattle That Lock.
Yeah, I also enjoy this album. I would say I definitely enjoy it more than Rattle That Lock. There's some great moments. We've already mentioned Between 2 Points, but to me, Scattered is a song that I can listen to over and over and over and over again. It's very, very good. And live, it's even better, and I know we'll get to that. But the solo in Scattered is up there with his best solos, in my opinion.
It's interesting. I'm interested to hear these sort of your guys' feedback, because for me, I struggle with that album a little bit. I will agree. I think Scattered is probably one of the best things that David has ever done. I think live it was really great. But for me, the album, I still have kind of a hard time getting into it, especially with Between 2 Points. I really struggle with that song. I really have a hard time with that album.
The thing is, I always ask myself, if I listen to any solo work or even A Momentary Lapse of Reason or Division Bell, would I listen to that song or that album if it would not be related to Pink Floyd? I think being a Pink Floyd fan and loving the early and Wish You Were Here and Dark of the Moon and everything, I mean, there's a lot of tolerance listening to something like Radio Chaos, for example. Maybe not that tolerant, but anyway. The David Gilmour Luck and Strange album is the first album where I can personally say, forget Pink Floyd, this could have somebody released calling Jack Miller, and I would like it. But I have to somehow, separate it from the old Floyd and being a Pink Floyd fan and everything. And once I managed that, I really start loving it. And I think that's the point. And that's what the whole new approach with the new producer and everything for me personally created. And that's now coming to the tour, created such a wonderful tour experience. Even I, unfortunately, did not see him live last year. but the combination of that very new sound, a new approach, and it really comes to life being played live, in combination with the wonderful songs he picked for the set list for that tour. To me personally, it's a contender to the 2006 tour. I'm really angry at myself not being able to see him live last year, because I love it very much.
I saw 2 shows. I think Joe and I might have saw the same shows or one of the same shows, but I saw 2. One was on.
I saw 8 shows on that tour. Which ones did you see?
I saw the 29th of October at Hollywood Bowl, and I saw the 30th of October at Hollywood Bowl, and I didn't see the Halloween show. I left before that. So I saw 2 first shows at Hollywood Bowl. I thought it was very good. Some of the set choices are great. Marooned sticks out as it was fantastic to see Marooned live. I thought it could have taken a bit more risk, if that makes sense. The thing I loved about 06 was you always had these rotating songs that were coming in and out. It was Wearing the Inside Out one night, or it was, Dominoes another night. And there was all these they were mixing it up. And I don't think he changed the set at all, other than adding Sings right near the end of the tour for the Royal Albert Hall shows. And that was it. With that said, Sorrow, fantastic. Love seeing that live. Amazing. Scattered. I've said a lot about Scattered already, but I think Scattered should have closed the show, to be honest with you. I would have liked that probably better than Comfortably Numb. I know that is probably sacrilegious, but it was fantastic. And I just think it's one of the best things he's done.
So we saw the same show. I saw the 30th and the 31st at the Hollywood Bowl. I went with some friends of mine. And I thought the 30th was okay. 31st I thought was a lot better. But I saw 6 shows at the Royal Albert Hall before the Hollywood Bowl, and really only 2 of the 6 shows that I saw really did anything for me. I really struggled with this last tour. I don't know. There was something about it. Maybe it's just me personally, but I had a really hard time with it. I thought the 14th and the 15th of October the Royal Albert Hall was great, but the other 4 shows that I saw really didn't do much for me. I was a little put off. But for me personally, I say the Luck and Strange tour is probably my least favorite David Gilmour tour that he's done.
Did you see him live, Bjorn?
No, I didn't. And as much as I loved the album, well, one of the reasons was that when I was considering seeing him live, the tickets were already sold out, and the prices was just ridiculous anyway.
Yeah, same for me.
Yeah, but the other reason was that as much as I loved the album, I had a really, as I mentioned, a really bad feeling after the last tour and album, so I wasn't expecting anything. I love the album, but I was a bit reluctant to see him live this time. I felt satisfied. Maybe that's not the right word, but I have been lucky and seeing him so many times, so I didn't need to see him this time. And I was also afraid that I was going to be walking away from the shows being disappointed with his voice and his playing this time. And listening back to the tour, there seems to be more variation between the quality between the shows, and I think you also sort of confirm that with these experiences that you've had. And we also see him having to transpose songs like Coming Back to Life, which really started out to be a real struggle for him this time, and it's understandable. He's closing in at 80, so you can't expect him to sing like he did when he was 25 or 60. But again, I didn't want to be seeing him perhaps for the last time and be disappointed.
Yeah, I totally get that, and I totally understand all of you, but maybe it's seeing Roger Waters live at the same time a few years back, and having all the troubles listening to Roger Waters' banter and being less and less about music, and at the same time David Gilmour being like 78 or 79 at that stage, playing live and putting together a band and doing all that. And I totally get you, Mike, that he did not change any set list, but I mean, he had a teleprompter on stage, not to forget. the lyrics. I mean, shuffling the set list is maybe a little bit too much. And I don't know, I feel some warmth inside of me having him and his daughter together on stage. And to be honest, I think for the very last time, I was very tolerant, and I am very tolerant. And I'm happy and humble and grateful that he did it, actually. Maybe that's why I'm not too harsh about it. But I totally get your point.
Yeah, I think in regards to the set list, I think I've seen some pictures of the set list with some additional tracks or some tracks that they rehearsed on either before the tour or during sound checks. But I also think that this tour was so complicated and huge in terms of the show that a sudden change of the set list, even to put in a random song, would have been just too much for this kind of production.
Yeah, might be. So, before we wrap it all up, what are our final thoughts about 40 years of David Gilmour alive? Something we tried at least to celebrate tonight with this little podcast. Bjorn?
Well, I mean, I've been, since I started to play guitar and been a musician myself, David Gilmour and Pink Floyd has been such an important part of my life and me as a songwriter and guitarist. So it's and I've been lucky to having seen him live, and especially with as a solo artist. And there's so much stuff that you can go back to, not only with Pink Floyd, but also with his first solo album. It's an album that I listen to regularly. I go back to the promo films from 78 and his 84 tour. I still listen to the bootlegs from that tour and enjoy his sound, his tone, and also something that we may not discuss this time, but it's interesting to hear how he's developing his playing and his tone as a solo artist and brings that into the band and vice versa. Also going back to him as perhaps not the most confident artist, I think despite of that, he's done incredibly well as a solo artist and really proven himself as a great musician, not only as a guitarist, but also as a musical conductor, and being able to pull together a band and people he's working with in the studio, producers and everyone, that really has brought something to the table.
Yes. Well said.
I mean, what more can I say? I mean, it's David Gilmour. You know, he's been an indispensable part of my life in the best times and the absolute worst times. I don't know if he's going to do another album. He's said that, you know, he wants to do another album, but, you know, it was 10 years roughly between On an Island, Rattle That Lock, and then another 10 years between Rattle That Lock and Luck and Strange. He's said that he's more motivated than ever to do another album, but we'll see if it actually materializes. I think he's got another album in him before he calls it a day. If he does another album, I would imagine he probably does a couple dates, probably nothing on the scale that we saw for Rattle That Lock or the Luck and Strange tour. But if he does it, I'm game. I'll be there.
Yeah, for me, I mean, I feel the same. I mean, David Gilmour, I've seen Gilmour a bunch of times. I've seen Waters a bunch of times. I've seen Pink Floyd. Gilmour's really the draw of all those things. And even when I see Roger Waters, if I'm being honest, I'm going to see some of the Gilmour solos recreated, like in the Animals material or stuff like that. So seeing Gilmour live is something special. I feel really lucky that I've seen him as many times as I can, because he doesn't tour very often. I respect the hell out of him for being an 80-year-old man and still refusing to go on a greatest hits tour. He must have new material before he goes out. I love that. I love that he plays his whole album and won't just play a 90% Pink Floyd material show. I don't want to see that personally, because I know the songs he would play, and those are the ones I don't want to see anyway. So I'd much rather see him hit the road when he's got something that he's proud of and he wants to show off. I do think he's going to put another album out. It certainly seems that way based off of Paulie's social media posts, and he's definitely been in the studio since Luck and Strange. I agree completely with Joe. I expect the scale of whatever it is he does live to diminish even further, as it has pretty progressively since On an Island. So maybe a couple shows here and there. Maybe we're lucky, one in North America. Who knows? But yeah, I'm game. I would love to see him one more time, and hopefully that happens.
I personally feel sadness about the whole thing. I mean, Roger Waters being as old as he is, and the guy he is, and David Gilmour also not really getting younger. And I feel really grateful for all that's been presented to us and recorded and taped through all these wonderful tapers and the official material. I mean, we just got the best of all worlds. We got the Pink Floyd, the early Pink Floyd, so many live recordings. We got the Roger Waters solo tours, and I said it in another podcast, everything Roger Waters did between 1999 and 2002 is really great for me personally. He had a great band, and his live shows were really wonderful. I saw him live, and it was just a wonderful experience. I saw him live, The Wall, touring The Wall, and I cried the whole show with my best friend. And David Gilmour the same. And I saw Nick Mason's Sauce Full of Secrets so many times now. I saw him in Rome, which was, again, with my best friend, a wonderful night. And having all these experiences and having the archive we have of recordings is so wonderful. One cannot be grateful enough for all that. And I really hope that David will get the time to do another album, and whatever comes out will be great. And yes, it's 40 years. I mean, impossible. I mean, 4 decades, and still creating new material. I mean, most bands now do their greatest hits tours and nothing else, and do not have the guts to create something new. And he did, and he does, and I'm really happy for that. So let's wrap it up, guys. It was really a wonderful discussion. One can really hear and see how much time you spend in preparing, and thank you very much, Bjorn, for your time. And it was wonderful support and a great podcast. Thank you very much, guys.
It was an honor. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Nils.
Thank you. Thank you.
So thank you all for listening to this episode. Thank you very much. Have a good night. Bye-bye.